This program is brought to you by the following proud sponsors. The Alltech Media Group, the region's leading multimedia video production and marketing company, creating powerful and innovative marketing strategies that deliver exponential returns. The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.
Welcome to Randall Lewis seminar that took place on Thursday, October 27th at CSERT. Barry Wallerstine, the former executive officer for the South Coast Air Quality Management District, presented a terrific look at air quality, sort of past, present, and future. And hopefully in our exchange, we can do some of that today. I sort of want to look a little bit at the kind of context of air quality control, some of the reasons of success, how you explain that kind of success, and then looking toward the future, what can we expect, and kind of close with what for this region, which air quality has always been an important issue, what kinds of things groups and leaders should advocate for air quality. But I think the context I think is important, that what's happened in Southern California is an example of regulatory success. It's a major success story. Just had some people from Beijing were here talking about how did it happen? How did you go from the kind of bad air to what you now find now? I personally think if you took a big picture look, South Coast District is the best in the world in what it does. And so I should say, by way of disclosure, as you know, I served on the board for a number of years, so I had some small part in what is we're talking about today. But I mean, we all sort of, over the age of 50, remember air quality is, we couldn't see mountains, you felt it in your chest, you're very self-conscious. Every kind of polling that was done out in this region, air quality was ranked number one. And how do we move from that air that we saw in the 50s and 60s to what we find now?
So when we look at Southern California, because of the ring of mountains, the inversions that form in the summertime that lead to the summertime smog, or in the wintertime lead to high particulate levels where it's a cold air immersion level, what we have is really the perfect factory in some regards for creating air pollution. In spite of all of that, over the years, with the efforts that we've put into place, and that is a combination of government, industry, and the general public, we have really one of the great success stories in the United States in all environmental management. But when we talk about air quality challenges, as shown on this slide, we're talking about our traditional summertime smog that we think of. We now are much more acutely aware about the hazardous impacts of small particles in the air, and that's something that has been a focus for the last couple of decades. And we're also concerned about air toxics that are in the air, such as carcinogens. And we've made remarkable progress, as I'll show in another slide in a moment, on those issues. But we also have issues that are more of an emerging nature, even though we have some good scientific basis even to date, and that includes climate change or greenhouse gas emissions and the effects that that can have on us, not only locally, but obviously the entire world, as well as what we call ultrafine particles, the smallest of the particles, which is an area of increasing concern because of their size. They can move around in the human body.
So in terms of rules and regulations, they've become much more complex given these multiple challenges rather than...
We've finally, the scientific community and the governmental agencies involved and the planning portion of the work that we do, we've come to a much better understanding that we can't do planning in silos, that this needs to be comprehensive, integrated planning that allows us to maximize the benefits for the dollars spent and the actions being taken. And we're fortunate that many of the things that are required for summertime smog are the same things that are required to reduce the fine particles and even climate change. If we look at this slide as an example where we're looking at ozone and particulate levels that have occurred over the last several decades and the downward trend that is shown on this slide. And then if we look at the lines on the upper part of the graph that represent population growth, economic growth, and employment, what we see is we have had, as I was saying before, a remarkable success story where we have very, very significant reductions in the air pollution and therefore improvements in public health. And at the same time, we've been able to grow the economy and we've been able to absorb a much larger population. And that's why I say this is one of the great success stories in environmental management. We've been talking about the reduction in summertime smog, and as shown on this slide, we've had since the 70s over a 62% reduction in summertime smog here in Riverside County. That's tremendous progress, even with the substantial amount of growth that we've had. When we talk about air toxics as a subject, as shown on this slide, the major impact is from motor vehicle traffic. It represents over 90% of the key pollutants that contribute to air toxics. And diesel particulate is nearly 70% of the overall problem. And relative to successes, reducing air toxics has been one of our great successes. We did what's called a MATES study, multiple air toxic exposure study. And when we looked at air toxics in the overall region in 2005, then redid the study in 2012, made a comparison, we saw that air toxics in each of the 4 counties within South Coast had been reduced by more than 50%.
Wow, that's more than an incremental change.
It's, again, a great success, coming together and putting the right policies in place. However, there's a caveat to that success story. The science has progressed, including health studies on especially young individuals, early age. And what that shows is that we've been underestimating the health impacts of air toxics over the years. And in fact, by a factor of 2. This next slide shows graphically what the air toxics levels looked like from our MATES study. And the darker the color on the slide, the higher the risks. And what this shows is, again, the correlation to transportation sources, so that you see along the transportation corridors and especially down in the port is where the air toxics risks have been the highest. Now, when we talk about health effects, and especially when we look at issues of mortality, I think I want to draw a real distinction between air pollution versus some other circumstances. So if we look at this slide, we're all used to things like the warning on a pack of cigarettes. We're intimately familiar with campaigns about things like drinking and driving. We, on the daily news, whether it be on a newspaper, a printed newspaper, or electronic newspaper, or we watch TV, We hear about the tragic loss of life, even a single life, because society rightfully values that. And of course, we're all aware of where we lose friends or colleagues or family members. But when we talk about air pollution, it's much harder to put a face on the individuals that may pass away from air pollution, because typically that's not noted on a death certificate. Yet there are epidemiological studies and other scientific studies that show statistically the relationship between air pollution to premature mortality.
And that research is pretty good now.
The research is excellent, but the point I'm trying to make is when you put a face on it, it has a different emotional impact and therefore maybe a different priority or understanding amongst the general public. And that is something that I think we all have to do a better job of educating the public on these impacts. One of the things that I covered in my seminar was looking at the leading causes of death. And I chose the year 2013, for which some data was readily available from the California Department of Health, and it's shown on this slide. And when one looks at the leading causes, whether it's heart disease or cancer or lower respiratory disease or some cardiovascular disease of the brain or even diabetes, which were leading issues here in the Inland Empire, there are studies that show for each of those that there is a relationship. It's, I think, also important to note that recent estimates that have been prepared as part of the upcoming revision to our local air quality management plan estimate that if we were to achieve the federal ozone standard that is required for 2023, that we would save over 2,000 lives a year. And there's another ozone standard that's required to be achieved by 2031, and in that case it would be roughly 2,500 lives a year. So this is clearly not a trivial issue for our society, either from a health perspective or an economic perspective. I like to think of environmental policy as potentially a pendulum that swings, and the economy is key, and we go through periods of rapid growth and change, and then we have obviously periods of recession. And what happens to the environmental policies is slow change or repeal when we're in a recession, or potentially more rapid change in policies for pollution controls when we have growth in the economy. The continued fight for clean air is going to be a significant one over the next couple of decades. What this slide shows is that we need to reduce one of the key building blocks to both ozone and particulate, that's oxides of nitrogen or NOx, by 43% beyond existing rules and regulations that are on the books today by 2023. So that's a very, very heavy lift, and by 55% in the year 2031. And the bottom line is that we really need to move to near zero and zero emission technologies, especially for transportation sources and other mobile sources. Over the years, there's obviously things that we've learned about meeting challenges large as the one we still face. We have to, first of all, make sure everything's science-based. We have to get the science right. We need consistency in policy. We don't want that pendulum swinging back and forth. The business community needs to know when they make an investment, the investment is good and sustained for an extended period of time. We have to look for a joint win between the economy, the environmental policy, and we need to consider when we're investing our limited dollars what the opportunity costs are. Do we invest here, or do we invest over here to meet our ultimate goals? And we have to move away from conflict, ideological boxes, and NIMBYism so that we can put things in place in a timely fashion.
One of the contexts, if you could just, I think most people maybe are familiar with the South Coast District, maybe less with Carr, but this is not simply the South Coast by itself. Can you kind of integrate the kind of federal rules, state rules, and sort of local rules?
Sure. So there truly are three layers to the overall air quality control program. There's the federal government, which has reserved for itself air pollution control requirements for certain types of pollution sources, such as trucks registered outside of California or large ocean-going ships, which are regulated by the federal government and through international agreements. They have principal authority over locomotive emissions and things of that nature. Then at the state level, we have the California Air Resources Board, which has principal authority over consumer products that we use in our homes, as well as a unique authority under the Federal Clean Air Act to regulate motor vehicle and truck tailpipe emissions, as well as emissions from off-road engines such as construction equipment, and then has more limited authority on vessels and locomotives.
One of the questions that obviously people are asking is with the new Trump administration, with the new director of EPA, what consequences does this have for what California is doing and what the South Coast is doing?
It has tremendous consequences. We not only need the federal government to further control pollution sources that are within its sole jurisdiction, we need the federal government to cooperate with the state of California on things that we want to do here in California and as part of that in Southern California to get to healthful air. If for any reason the federal government were to not be supportive of the state's actions, then that could not only either slow down the progress that's being made in California, but under some scenarios, extreme scenarios, it could even potentially start to reverse our trend of improving air quality. And so I hope that the new administration, or frankly any future administration, would recognize that California is about 10% of the national population. We have by far the worst air pollution problems in the country, especially here in South Coast and in the San Joaquin Valley, and we need their help. I think the thing to really note is that California, and Southern California in particular, we're the incubator for much of the national air pollution control program. And in fact, California is an incubator for much of the international air pollution control program. And that we've been able to grow the economy, absorb additional population growth, and have remarkable reductions in air pollution. So we know how to do this. And it's a matter of not putting handcuffs on California relative to future actions.
I mean, as a board member, I remember you telling us that there are federal standards that the California needs to meet, and that has been one of the kind of reasons why the board needed to adopt different control measures. Again, are those standards in some uncertainty with new administration?
Well, in the last couple of years in Congress, there have been discussions about whether or not what historically has been a federal standard with a date certain by which it was to be achieved, to moving away from that date certain. And how one would go about doing that is incredibly important, because it could take pressure off of improving our air quality to the detriment of the breathing public.
One example of success of the district, I thought, was what took place on the two ports. We were about, 40 to 43% of the goods that come in the United States come through LA and Long Beach. And it was a major source of at least photochemical smog. What took place?
The cleaning of the air related to the ports over the last decade has been an incredible success. But again, I have to say we have to go much further. But if we look at goods movement as a topic, goods movement is a major contributor to our summertime smog and particulate levels, and also a major contributor to our air toxics levels.
Well, Barry, one of the things you did at the end of your presentation was talk about how this field is sort of changing, and in terms of when we look to the future in terms of policy and air quality. Could you talk a little bit about what I mean, you've been in this business for 30 years. How's this field changing?
Well, the first change is one that I noted, is this people coming together to realize we can no longer plan in silos, that while we talked to each other before, we're now moving more towards true integration. I think a second major change that we're having to incorporate is really the prominence now of climate change as a topic and what to do about greenhouse gases, and the realization that we need to either change the types of fuels and modes of transportation we're using, or we need to, again, significantly advance the technology relative to any of the more traditional fuels.
You've been a big champion of clean energy. Why is that?
Energy is really kind of the common denominator for local air pollution problems as well as climate change, because when we look at where does the pollution come from, most of our pollution problem, whether it's air toxics or ozone or particulates, is from transportation sources. So toxics transportation sources are over 90% of the problem region-wide. For ozone, it's 80% of the problem region-wide, and similar for particulates, for the fine particles at least that we're most concerned about. So we have to find a way, in my view, to further electrify the transportation fleet, and that includes both battery electric vehicles, further use of sophisticated hybrids, as well as fuel cell vehicles, as we're now seeing the first commercial fuel cell cars available from large international vehicle manufacturers. And we know how to generate electricity in a renewable fashion that's basically zero pollution generation of electricity, whether it be solar, wind, or some other techniques.
In your Randall Lewis seminar, you expressed your kind of optimism about the future and ability to meet these kind of challenges. So why optimism?
I think now we're at a point in time where the scientific community truly knows what's needed, but beyond that, we know what the technologies are, and those technologies are far enough along at this point that we can see them progressing in the relatively short term into the commercial marketplace if, and this is a big if we put the right policies in place to encourage companies to truly invest in bringing those technologies to the marketplace. And this is where California's historically been a leader, and I would expect would continue to be so. But we need the federal government more than ever to be a full partner in the innovation that's going to be needed.
Why is public input or involvement important?
Because in a hearing room where a plan or a regulation is being decided upon, it is the personal stories of impact, whether it's a resident or a small business owner, etc., that really can have tremendous ultimate impact on the decision being made.
You can hear those. You can hear,
I you know, for more than 2 decades, I would present rules or be the executive officer, and you'd watch the flow of a hearing, and you could watch where one witness would get up and their story about the impact of air pollution on their family or on their business would cause a difference, significant difference in the decision. And usually the companies being regulated have professional representation. The staff is there to represent both the companies that are being regulated as well as the general public. But getting the general public to come out to the meeting is one of the most important things that can happen in my view, in terms of getting good decisions.
Inland Southern California, the 2 downwind counties, if you were to give recommendations to its leadership, what would you say?
The first thing that popped into my head is that you can have it all. And by that I mean you can have cleaner air, healthful air ultimately, and a growing economy here in the Inland Empire, and that doesn't have to be one or the other. There are some that think you have to choose. I think you'd say the choice is we want both.
Been in this business, Ed, for 30 years. Let's push ahead 30 years. Let's say it's now 2050. What's air quality and air quality control regulations look like in 2050?
The word that pops into my mind is gravely concerned about whether we're doing enough now and will in the near term, along with the rest of the United States and the international community, to combat climate change. The thing that I think gets lost sometimes with the general public is we're used to thinking of air pollution comes out a stack or a tailpipe, the wind blows it to the east. Once you get far enough downwind, it's diluted or changed in the atmosphere, or if we have a couple of days of rain, the pollution's washed out of the sky. Yeah. But when we talk about pollutants that contribute to climate change, especially when we talk about something like carbon dioxide, we're talking about something that lives in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So what we don't do today is going to burden the globe in the future. So when I think of my 2 granddaughters that I was blessed with this last couple of weeks, I think about the fact that if I'm not driving a battery electric car, then the air pollution coming out of that tailpipe of that car will contribute to changing environment and all the things that go along with that for the entire lifetime of my grandchildren. You know, as you know, I closed my presentation with a quote from President Kennedy where he said, "There are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction." And when we talk about air pollution or climate change, that is absolutely the truth of it.
Well, Barry, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation, and as we ask the question, what's the future of Southern California? Air quality and choices we make are central to that future. So thank you very much, and enjoyed the exchange.
Well, thank you for having me.
This program is brought to you by the following proud sponsors: the Alltech Media Group, the region's leading multimedia video production and marketing company, creating powerful and innovative marketing strategies that deliver exponential returns. The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.